On this episode, my guest is author and researcher Dr. David Edward, who joins me to talk about his book, Atlantis Solved, the final definitive proof. Plus, the world mourns the passing of the Queen, and we enter a new age. All this and more on today's Open Highway.
The Open Highway with Eric Erickson.
Hello, all you travelers on the Open Highway. I'm your host, Eric Erickson. Thank you once again for joining me on the show. As always, it's a pleasure to have you here, and it's a pleasure to bring this program to you. So, thank you. Things are a little different today. We are going to get right into it. We have promos now. We've reached a point where we have promos, so this is amazing. So today I'm going to talk about one little subject, and then we're going to get right into it with my guest, Dr. David Edward. And he's going to talk about his book, Atlantis Solved, the final definitive proof. This is an incredible interview. You may have heard him on other shows like Coast to Coast, talking about this archaeological discovery. Is it Atlantis? Is it a different culture? We're going to talk about that. So that's coming up in a bit. As I said, we now have promos on the show. We're working with some different companies. You're going to hear these commercials and promos, which is a huge thing. I'm really happy about this. So all I ask is, hey, if it sounds interesting, check them out. There's some promo codes. You can save a little money for being a fan of the Open Highway. It's a great chance to support us, support some companies, get some great stuff. Just do the shopping you're going to do anyway. So look for those. You're going to hear them. Links in the show notes, all that stuff. You're pretty experienced at that by now. So this week was the funeral for Queen Elizabeth. We knew it was coming. It was a little early for me. I didn't get up, but I definitely watched the replays of it. And there were a lot of moments that really struck me, I'm sure like everybody out there. But one thing that really struck me, one moment, was at the end. And you may remember this. It's the moment where Charles was handed the items and he put them on the casket. And I have to admit, you may have seen, he was holding it back. I really think, losing your mother, I give him full credit, king or not. Being able to do that and stand in that moment. No one wants that moment, and we all have to face it. And he had to face it in front of millions of people. So I give him full credit for that, for being able to do that. I'll be honest with everybody. I mean, that's what I do on the show, right? I'm honest. My own mother my dad died when I was younger. My own mother is getting up there. I hope she has many, many more years on the earth. But I know that the day that she passes, it will absolutely destroy me like many other people. When they lose their parents. So, I feel for Charles seeing that moment. In addition to that moment, you probably saw the Lord Chamberlain take his, it's a working stick, his staff I'm not quite sure the exact name for it, but he symbolically breaks it in half and he places it on the coffin. And that's to symbolize that his work is done because the monarch has passed. And it's a really symbolic moment, not only because, one, we've never seen it before, because they've never televised the death of the funeral of a British monarch before. So it was the first time we actually got to see it. We'd heard of it, but we never got to see it before. But the commentators said something that really struck me. They said, we are truly seeing the end of the post-war age. And I really was moved by that because they're right. Queen Elizabeth was the last monarch, leader, person really of a figure left over from World War II and then the post-war movement and everything that's happened over her 70-year reign. So we really did see the end of an era when he snapped that. That is a physical moment of the end of the post-war era. And in conjunction with that, you may have heard the Biden interview this week where he talked about how he came out and he said the pandemic is over. We're still dealing with COVID, but the pandemic is over. And whether whether you hate Biden, you like Biden, whether you think he's Satan or you think he's the second, whatever you think about him, for the president of the United States to actually say that and draw a line in the sand, that's a big thing. That's a big moment. And to have those two events happening at the same time, it got me thinking. It got me thinking about, we are moving into a new era. What is that era going to be? Things are really uncertain. We have war, we have inflation, we have all climate issues. It's really a telling moment. And in a strange way, for once, we can almost see the mark in history where society moved from one point to another. And that really affected me. It really did. So, yeah, that's my editorial moment. Talked about it last week, where make sure that you're giving your opinion and not just, the facts. But that's my opinion. And yeah, definitely it got me thinking. So just wanted to share that with everybody. But let's get to our interview. I'll be back after this with my guest, Dr. David Edward. This is a company I am not just happy but proud to bring you. Black Helmet Apparel creates high-quality clothing, accessories, and equipment for firefighters, police officers, military personnel, and those who support them. Founded by a third-generation firefighter, all the designs are hand-drawn and unique. No clip art, no cheesy sayings, just images that relay the fearless but frightening side of a firefighter's job. Apparel, gear bags, bunker gear, and a full line of accessories, plus unique and amazing challenge coins. And check out their pink line collection that raises money for breast cancer awareness. BlackHelmetApparel.com. Join their mailing list for 10% off your first order. The link is in the show notes, BlackHelmetApparel.com, where frightening meets fearless. So, my guest today is Dr. David Edward. He is the author of Atlantis Solved, the final definitive proof. You may have heard him on Coast to Coast or various other outlets. He is the author of over 40 books, including the thriller Panama Red. It's a bestseller. It's the first book in a series that sold over 100,000 copies. He is a former U.S. military special agent. He has 4 graduate degrees, including a doctorate in engineering. He's a podcast host. He's a busy guy. So he is joining me today, and we're going to talk about Atlantis. Here he is. Here's where I want to start, because I heard your interview the other day. You are a self-professed geek.
Oh yeah, nerd.
So, yes, a nerd. So we need to get the lingua franca going. So I need to know, what world are we dealing with? What's your base of geekiness, nerdiness?
Oh, I don't know. A mainstream, 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, kooky TV books, that kind of stuff. Of recently, I've kind of checked out from everything. Actually, that's why I started writing my own books, because I didn't like a lot of the current entertainment. So now I entertain myself by writing.
So we are we talking Star Wars? Or are we talking Star Trek? Are we talking random
Star Trek, X-Files,
Okay.
Terminator, Aliens, Jaws, those counts of the third kind. I love the 6 Resident Evil movies with Mila Jovovich. Love them.
Really?
I've watched each one probably 12 times. I think they're brilliant. Yeah. So geek.
Okay, so at least we have that down. So,
Matrix
okay,
Reloaded. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I'm a Stargate fan. I'm a Stargate fan. So I find that an interesting segue to your work, because obviously, they do the whole Atlantis thing and they went this whole other way with it.
Yeah.
But talk to me how you got into that. What grabbed you and drew you into that world?
Well, as a little kid, like a lot of people, I was just drawn to it as a little kid. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and Eric Von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods, was big. And there were lots of TV shows. Jacques Cousteau was on. Every now and then he'd do kind of a kooky show. But there wasn't as much content as there was now. So I read what I could. I loved all of that stuff, but I kind of ran out of content. So I started reading what they call the classical Greek literature. So I had read all of Plato. I've read the histories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the plays like the Clouds and the Wasps, and just so Xenophon. I love Xenophon. He's my favorite historical
Mm.
character. So I just went there because there was nowhere else to go, kind of mainstreamy. So then a couple years ago, no, not a couple years ago, about about 7, 8 months ago, I was watching YouTube because I had listened to all the open highway that I possibly could.
Hey.
Just you hit the fifth or sixth time through, and it's like I got it. Okay, I feel the rhythm of it. So I flipped over, and YouTube gave me a recommendation to a channel called Bright Insight with this guy Jimmy Corsetti, which everyone kind of knows. And in 2018, he had kind of broke the story that there's this place in Mauritania in the Western Sahara in Western Africa that he thought looked a lot like Atlantis. And he's an army guy. I was an army guy, so I resonated with it. And he makes a really compelling a case, I think.
Mm.
But he got some things wrong, and I'm familiar with the literature. So, I felt like he was close. I mean, I feel like he's right, but he wasn't sealing the deal. And then he went on Joe Rogan, and it was a great interview, but he didn't seal that. He wasn't authoritative, and he didn't have the background to kind of push that last 15% to say, for real, is this it or not?
Right.
So I was like really intrigued. So I started my own research, and I said, I'm gonna I'm an engineer and historian, I guess. So I'm going to take an engineering approach to this. I want to go in. I want to push away everything they call secondary sources. I want to focus on the primary sources, figure out what they are, and
Mm.
then see if I can start from that and then decompose into requirements, because we're modern people, so we can use a modern way of looking at things, and then find those requirements and see if I can find places on the earth that match. And I didn't look everywhere. There's I've got my list here. There's like five or eight or so places that everyone kind of gravitates to when it comes to where they think Atlantis is. So one of them was this Rishat structure, which sure does look like it. It's the only one that looks like it. Then there's the Azore Islands, and there's a
Mhm.
lot of people that really think it might be the Azores. Spain, they found some stuff. Matter of fact, every year or two, there's this big headline that says, modern academics dig a hole, find a circle, and it found Atlantis. And
Mhm.
Spain, we just went through that with Spain a couple years ago. Santorini, the Bimini Road, the Minoans on Crete, Malta, a lot of people like Antarctica. So I looked at all those places and the Rishat structure. And the only one that came even close was the Rishat structure to matching literally what Plato said. Not all the stuff we've heard about it. And I don't mean to be the Grinch that stole Christmas, but that probably wasn't power death ray crystals. There's not nuclear submarines, probably not UFOs. Doesn't mean there wasn't knowledge that was very beneficial. But when you look at this place and you project back into the time period of what was going on, we were in the middle of what they call the Green Sahara. It's the Neolithic Revolution or Renaissance, and we can get into all those details. But you look at it really hard and you think, okay, if I was dragging my knuckles and eating dino ribs, and I came across this place, it's like a paradise. It's like a perfect place to live. It's very defensible. It's very accessible. The ground is fertile, and I'm just like, you know, everything fits. What Plato says fits, and Plato hits some milestones that would almost be impossible for him to have just guessed, or almost impossible to be coincidence. Not all of them. And then you look at what was going on in that time. We're in what they call the pre-pottery Neolithic. You look at where agriculture was. All you look at everything, and then you look at this place, and it's like, yeah, no, people would have lived on it. It just would have happened.
So
So
let's talk about that for a second. So it sounds like that old idea of science is indistinguishable from magic to a civilization that hasn't achieved it. So like you're saying is like a knuckle dragging person sees something advanced. We don't have to have spaceships and death rays and all of that. Because why do we think that? Why do so many people think that Atlantis is this ahead of where we are now, and it was 9,600 years ago? Because like you've
yeah,
actually
9600 BCE, which is like 11,622 years ago.
okay, so like that's the actual time based on
Yeah,
the historical stories and everything. So but why do we
yeah.
think it has to be that?
Well, look, Atlantis has been beaten to death. This is one of the things I talk about. If and I even opened the book with, if something can be anything, can we ever accept it as just something? And there's a lot of people. In fact, all those shows I talked about, and they're still making them, and I watch them. I've watched every one of those shows, and the pitch is always the same, which is the first half is a bunch of pretty good looking people going to some really cool looking places and
Hmm.
islands and beautiful water and the Greeks and all this stuff, and they kind of set you up that they figured it out. Then the second half is, yeah, but for it to be this place, we got to change this, we got to change this, we got to assume Plato didn't know this, we got to change this, and then maybe it kind of fits, and maybe there's like 4 or 5 places, but we don't know, and that's the pattern, and we have all lived through that pattern now so much that Atlantis is everything. And
Yeah.
there's something built into our imaginations. We like the idea of the wrapped Christmas present, right? What's in the box under the tree is a lot more exciting than the tube socks you get when you open it, And so Atlantis has just become that. And if you listen to the show, uh, I was on the other last week. We had a guy called in. He said that he had done a spiritual regression, and he was actually the assistant scientist who was running the death rate. He remembers yelling that it was going to blow to the lead guy, and then he remember seeing it blow and watching the mushroom cloud and all this. And I don't know. I have no clue whether he was that guy or not, and whether he really regressed or not. But Atlantis is everything, and it becomes very personal to people too.
Hmm.
So they project kind of their hopes and dreams. They project their desire for a better world. They project all this stuff onto it because it's a beautiful blank slate because it can be anything.
Right.
So yeah.
Now you come from a background of, I mean, you're former military.
Yep.
You're coming from a very practical background. Like we chatted, we talked at the beginning. It's like you're a nerd. You have your, Star Trek, Stargate. We talked about that, but you're coming from, uh, would you call it forensic? I mean, would you come from a background where you literally like, here's the facts. How can we lay them out against other facts in the research?
Yeah, I brought two things to the table. I brought the military experience and my job in the military. I was a 97 Bravo, which is a counterintelligence agent. So basically, the training there is you study what they call battlefield counterintelligence, and then human intelligence collection.
Hmm.
And what that means is I'm not like when I went through. I'm old, right? So when I went through, the Russians were the problem. Now they might be again. I don't know. But everything comes around. But at the time, they taught us how to recognize Russian troops. But my job was to look back on the U.S. forces, because I was in the U.S. military, and see if we were giving anything away. I mean, it is, every Tuesday before a live fire exercise, do all the moms go to the 7-Eleven the night before to get milk because, the guys are going to be away for a week, and all that kind of stuff. So it
Yeah.
allows me to look what we would say syntopically or systemically, across all that. So I have that background, and then I have a doctorate in engineering. I was actually president of a university. I've got like 3 master's degrees, and one of them is information management. So I've got the academic side and the engineering side. So I brought those two together, and I said that's how I'm going to approach this, because
Hmm.
I've read typically in academia, when you go after a topic, the first thing you do is what they call a review of the literature. Just meaning, what do people currently think? What are the ideas that have come and gone? What's the current critique on those ideas? And then what's the current prevailing wisdom or belief or whatever? Now, Atlantis is hard to do that, right? Because what are you going to review? There's so many books. Do I watch Stargate Atlantis for 6 seasons? And is that a review? Which I did. I watched seasons 2 through 5 or 6, whatever it was. I got hooked on it right when it was getting canceled, but it was a good show. But yeah, so I started doing that. I said, no, I can't do that. I said, instead, we're going to turn it around, and we're going to do what they call a primary source evaluation. So I want to see, and in academics, you have primary sources and what they call secondary sources. So primary sources is an authority where the idea, the invention, the knowledge, the wisdom, whatever it is, it's where it first appears, and it's viewed as an authoritative source. And then secondary sources are just people like me, people like you, people over the past 2,500 years, in this case, reading Plato and thinking about it and commenting on it.
Hmm.
And the challenge with that is it's just people like us, and they have their own opinions and their own agendas and all of that, but you got to push that aside. So when you push all that aside and you start from the beginning, and you bring the engineering principle of, if these are the requirements, then they're the requirements. If Plato said that it happened, that Solon went to Egypt in 600 BCE, and the Egyptians told him that Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before his visit, then you do the math, and that's what it is.
Hmm.
Um, in the dialogues, Plato uses the word stadia, which is a measurement. Well, you got to go figure out what that measurement is. And then whatever it is, you got to live with it. In our case, we're dealing with the Alexandrian measure because it had been translated from the ancient Egyptians, and that's 607 feet. So if Plato says something is 3,000 stadia long, then in today's world, that's 345 miles. You multiply 607 feet times 3,000 and divide it by 5,820, and you get the measurement. But so I said it's literally, and I literally can't dismiss anything. If it doesn't meet one of his requirements, then you get a low score versus you just take it off the list. And then I added up all the scores, which is
Right.
what I come to in the book. Yeah.
So that I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate, but at the same time, something is
Sure.
occurring to me. So
Sure.
so many people often say, "Oh, it's allegorical. It's
Yeah.
all allegorical. It's like none of it." But then you bring up something like you just said, and you said, "Okay, well, here's the measurements." Why would you do an allegorical story, but you'd actually put in these measurements for storytelling? Or does that give credence to what you're actually researching?
Well, look, there is people, for some reason, there is something built into about half of us that will accept a lot of things because it sounds good to us and we like the idea. And then there's the other half of us who will reject things, whether they sound right or not. And they'll throw up kind of straw man arguments. So this is
Mhm.
one of the things I point out. One of the big criticisms is, well, it's clearly an allegory. And it's like, well, not if you actually read it, because we're going to treat that source document as literal history. So we're going to believe what it says. That's part of this exercise,
Mhm.
and it's actually written. And people say, it was an oral tradition that got passed down to him over hundreds of years. So how could it be accurate? Any of that? But Plato goes out of his way to tell us two things. He provides the chain of custody for the information, and he goes out of the way to tell us he believes it's true
Mhm.
and to show us, to document how he could know it. So the guy, we're talking about a dialogue called Critias. There's four dialogues that mention Atlantean type stuff. Two of them mention Atlantis specifically, Timaeus and Critias. And then there are two others. One's called the Laws, one is called Statesman, that have some really kooky, wacky stuff in it about cataclysms, which is, of course, the thing that sank Atlantis. It was a cataclysm. It was a terrible event. But anyway, the Critias is talking and he goes out of his way to tell us. Critias says, "My great grandfather, Dryoppides, had the original writing, which is still in my possession and was carefully studied by me." Now, Plato doesn't waste space, and he tells us this. So he tells us that Solon, who would have been the one who wrote this, and Solon, by the way, 600 BC, so it's a couple hundred years before Plato. He is arguably the person that invented the idea of democracy. So he's kind of the one that started the Athenians on the path towards democracy. And as far as we know, this is the first time that form of government had ever been tried.
Mhm.
Now, he didn't just sit in a room in the dark or in his campfire, whatever you did in 600 BC, but so he's trying to figure this out. So he's talking to people, he's going around. One of the things he wanted to do was he went to Egypt because they're a storied um, civilization and they've been around forever. They've done a lot of things right. They've survived, which is good. And so he went to talk to them about how do they govern and their ideas. Now they didn't invent democracy, but he's just trying to get he's basically doing his literature review. When he's there and talking to the priests, they say, one of the things they get to is the Egyptians' ancient history. And a lot of the Egyptian history is recorded in scrolls and papyrus, like we would think, but also on the walls. We've all seen it, all the hieroglyphs and all that.
Yeah.
And they walked him through this story and helped him translate into Greek. And he wrote the story down on this scroll that he had, which is what he took back to Greece. And then Plato gives us the chain of custody for it. So it goes from him to his son through 4 or 5 generations to this guy Critias, who reads it, and then Plato is recording what Critias is telling him about the scroll.
Okay, so let me play devil's advocate again. So if you're looking at the walls or the documents, how do you differentiate between, okay, well, here's a story about Atlantis, or here's a history of this that we believe is true, versus, well, here's the tale of Horus having the god that came down and did this and did that which is mythology. So how do you forensically attack that and be able to differentiate mythology from history?
Is it mythology? I mean, I don't know.
Oh,
I don't know that it is.
it depends
I
who you
don't know.
talk to. We can talk about Noah's Ark too. I mean, there's a whole
Exactly.
discussion that too.
Yeah, no, there's all that. So what I here's my rule for this. I said for my analysis to work, I have to have assumptions.
Hmm.
I'm going to have only two assumptions I can think of right now. The first is I'm going to assume that Plato is reporting what he believes to be real history. So I'm not saying that it is real history. I'm saying that he believed it to be, and he says that, and he uses lots of allegories. In fact, his most famous work is called The Republic.
Hmm.
And all of us, when we were in ninth or 10th grade, carried The Republic around. It was a big, thick book. None of us read it,
Hmm.
but we carried it around for like 6 weeks, and we would pretend, and then we'd talk about it, and we kind of got a gist of what we thought might be in there. In The Republic is where his most famous allegory, which is called the cave. And basically what he's trying to do, what Plato was he was worried about a lot of things, but one of the things he was trying to figure out is there a fair way to govern a bunch of people? Because he noticed that once someone got in charge, the idea of what was just, that was one of his big things, what is justice, would tend to lean towards whoever had the biggest stick or whoever had the most power and influence.
Hmm.
So he's like, okay, is justice just the will of the stronger, would be one of his arguments, or is it an idea, or a principle that we can look to and then measure the real world against? And he said he would call that a form. So he would say, is there a form of justice? Just like there's a chair. We all look at a chair and we know whether it's a chair or not. It's not the same chair and it can look differently, but there's something about a chair. So there's a form of a chair that it's not real, but it's the idea of it. And then
Hmm.
there's all the chairs that we see. And he said, pretend you're in a cave and pretend you only see the shadows and blah, blah, blah. He builds it up and goes over it. But he says it's an allegory. So, okay, I'm just imagine if when we get to Atlantis, so he says the opposite. He says, we all believe this to be true. And here is the chain of custody for the information. So that lays the foundation there.
Okay. So let's talk about the actual area that
Mhm.
we're talking about. So where is it located? What do we have to work with? What are the actual forensic facts that we can start with?
Sure. The first thing, and I guess this a lot, which is if this is such a big deal and Plato had all these measurements, why didn't anybody, like Aristotle was a student of Plato's? So why didn't Aristotle like pick this up and run with it?
Hmm.
So if we're looking at this forensically, the first thing we want to find is that there was some independent verification that was done in Plato's time. And we have that. Plato famously started the first university called the Academy. And when he died, one of his students would be up to take the thing over and run it and all of that. And there are
Hmm.
basically two guys up for the gig. One guy, Aristotle, who we're all familiar with, and he went on to tutor Alexander the Great. And the
Hmm.
other guy's name was Crantor, who we never hear about. So Crantor became the school administrator, and Aristotle was pretty miffed he didn't get the job. And then after that, he kind of breaks with Plato and he starts to criticize him and all of that stuff. But he goes off to be famously brilliant on his own, comes up with a lot of his own ideas. He does his
Hmm.
tutoring. But Crantor liked Plato. So and then when Aristotle started to criticize Plato, and he started to criticize things like Critias and this idea of Atlantis and all that, Crantor says he went to Egypt and he independently verified the information with the priests of that time.
Hmm.
So we have an independent verification. Now your question was, where do I think it is?
You have it starts with the work of forgive me the name I'm um that you started with. So there's an area that we're looking at.
Oh, so yeah, I think Atlantis, what Plato is describing matches over 99% to this thing called the Rishat structure, which is also
Mhm.
called the Eye of the Sahara, which is in a country called Mauritania in West Africa. Now, first off, that name, Mauritania, no other, I mean, otherwise we in Africa, we have Mali, Chad, Morocco. Nothing
Mhm.
sounds like Mauritania. So even just the name of it kind of sounds cool.
Mhm.
Um, but it checks a lot of the bases. The big thing it does is it addresses two requirements that no other place addresses for this time period. The first is it addresses the size of the continent, because Plato tells us that the continent is bigger than Asia Minor and Libya combined.
Okay.
Okay, so Libya basically at the time was not quite as deep into Africa, as because now it extends down to I think Mali, uh, but it went farther west. So it went all the way into what we call today Morocco, and it goes all the way to something called the Atlas Mountains. Now that term Atlas is important because Atlas was the king of Atlantis. So it starts to the geography starts to tie together. We now have mountains that are still today called after the king of where this Rishat structure was, which is only a couple hundred miles to its south. So that's interesting. But Asia Minor and Libya, when you add them together, it's over a million, just about a million square miles. So so we like the Bimini Road. Well, you can't get to a million square miles around the Bimini Road because he tells us it's bigger than those two put together.
Yeah.
You look at Santorini, you look at Spain, you look at all these places, they can't meet that requirement. You look at the Azore Islands, even if land magically rose, which we can talk about. I'm very familiar with that theory. Even it doesn't get anywhere close to a million square miles. Now, West Africa does. And the plain that the Sahara is on is fascinating because it has all of the geographic features that Plato mentions. And at the time we're talking about, 9600 BC, it was known as the Green Sahara. So ample rainfall. It had the biggest freshwater lake on the planet at the time, Lake Chad, a huge lake in the middle of Africa. There were rivers, and it's well documented that there were rivers that kind of ran from Morocco and from Central Africa through where this Rishat structure is, and then continued on to the sea. The other thing that's nice about the Rishat structure being Atlantis is it unifies all these other theories. Because Plato tells us you have the city of Atlantis, you had the continent of Atlantis, and then you had the kingdom of Atlantis. And if you get out of the idea that every place has to be the capital, because there's only going to be one capital, and you start to look at these, he called them provinces, and he gives us the names of the rulers. Matter of fact, I've done some phonetic research, and we've lined up a good number of them. But you start looking at all these other places as provinces ruled by a prince, and then everything else fits because none of them there. Nowhere else do you find this concentric ring structure that looks like the capital city, like the Rishat does. But in each of those places, there's something interesting that seems to have been going on around this time period. So it all kind of fits together.
So what about, and again, devil's advocate,
Sure. Yeah.
what about artifacts? What about
Mhm.
currency? I mean, if trading with other civilizations, where are the remnants of that? Why do we not have coins with Atlas's head on it? You know,
Right.
with everything going on with the Queen, it's on the forefront of our mind right now because they're getting ready to change the currency in UK. But so
Mhm.
where is that?
Well, look, there's this desire to project back this word advanced
Mhm.
to mean something that would be advanced to us today versus maybe advanced for the time. We have a lot of what you're talking about. So one of the nice things is the Rishat structure fits into our current narrative of history. So I mentioned we're in the Neolithic Renaissance or Revolution, whatever you want to call it. We know around the Mediterranean, we see agriculture. We see with the transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculture around 10,000 BCE. So this is 400 years after that. Around where this Rishat structure is, they have found. Oh, by the way, we're in the Neolithic period. So
Okay.
not to be confused with like the Mesolithic and some other lithic. So the Neolithic means the new Stone Age, Neolithic, new Stone Age, compared to the Middle Stone Age or the older Stone Age. And we
Mhm.
find exactly what you would expect to find for people with that level of technology. We find stone pots, we find stone tools, we find stone spearheads and all that kind of stuff. And clearly the place was occupied, and this area was occupied, and we find tools specific to that occupation.
Really?
What Plato tells us Atlantis was good at was two things. And I'm going to answer your question because I know where all this junk is, and we just have to go look at it. But when they were advanced in agriculture. He goes out of his way, and there's pages and pages of explaining all this, which I can go into, which we have found traces of massive engineering, ground engineering, aqua engineering, controlling the flow of water around this Rishat structure, which is in the middle of the Sahara Desert. So it's not recent. It can only date to a time period when the Sahara was green. But they were good at that, and they were good at organizing themselves. So I mentioned that King Atlantis, Plato tells us that there were the provinces of Atlantis were ruled by 5 sets of male twins. So if you take 5 sets of male twins, that goes to 10. So there's 10 provinces. One of them is the capital. The other ones are all over the place, and we have the phonetic names. Like one of the eldest of the fifth set of twins, his name was Azores. Okay, well that's probably
Okay.
the Azore Islands, and it fits. You know what I mean? And they call them diving islands and all of that. Um, but they had an agreement. Basically, they were like NATO, and they said no province is allowed to go to war or attack another province. If any of the provinces get attacked, we all agree to come to their aid, and each prince can rule on their own. But for capital crimes involving different criteria, you have to bring it to all the princes to agree. So you can't just kill your subjects, willy-nilly. Which is hugely advanced for
Yeah.
9600 BC. It's hugely advanced for 1200 BC. But we're not going to find those things, right? There's nothing. I mean, 10,000 years is an incredibly long time. 11,000
So
years.
so yeah, so let's for the discussion then. I wish I had my history books in front of me. So what's going on in the rest of the world at this time?
Yeah.
What's the comparable civilizations 9600 BC?
Well, the Neolithic, so the Stone Age. Just what we think of as cavemen. Now, it's not quite that bad. I mean, there's been 3 events that have laid the way for kind of mainstream, to use that term, folks to start to accept isn't the right word, but start to be open to more things. So we have Hendrik Schliemann found Troy.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he found it was he said he treated the Iliad as history, same exact principle that I used here. We had Francisco de Orellana, who was the first Westerner to traverse the Amazon, and this is in 1542. He went all the way from the western side or the eastern side to the western side, and he reported massive advanced civilizations and construction and all this stuff. Then 100 years later, the next person went back and it was all gone. So they said he made it up. If you look at you talk about a history book, you crack open a history book, they still say right now that he made it all up and it wasn't there. But just in the past 2 years, LiDAR has proven that they were there.
Yeah.
So that's been a breakthrough. And then the last thing, which goes to your question, is even though Göbekli Tepe, which is in Turkey, it was discovered in the 60s. Only within the past 10 years has the dating of 9600 BC coincidentally been accepted. So 10 years ago, if we were having this conversation, I wouldn't have an answer for you because there would be nothing to point to other than speculation. But now we know exactly. I mean, the same exact time, 9600 BC, we have Göbekli Tepe, which is this huge stone, not megalithic necessarily, although there's some big stones, but it's just huge ability to organize people.
Tepe fascinates me. I mean, it's fascinating, especially when you look at the stonework and you look at the way that some of these things were put together. It's out of time.
If you're looking for some comparable piece of what this rich structure would have looked like with the Atlanteans living on it, think green, lush agriculture, and probably to a level of stonework comparable to Göbekli Tepe.
That's incredible.
So
what's there now? What is at this location?
Let me finish answering your question.
I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. You got me all excited. You got me.
I know. But other important things are going on. So Plato gives us this date 9600 BC, which is the end of the last ice age, and there was the end of an event called the Younger Dryas. Okay. So for him to nail that date gives a lot of credibility to his date. Again, we have all these coincidences, but this is important because the world was coming out of, we were in the last ice age, and then something happens in 9600 BCE where the temperatures rise on the planet about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And that was the end of the Younger Dryas. Now, what's a Dryas, I guess is a question. It turns out there's been 3 Dryases: the Younger Dryas, the Older Dryas, and the Oldest Dryas. I don't know who's naming this stuff, but it's pretty utilitarian naming in a way. Mm-hmm. And a Dryas is a flowering plant that does really well at colder and higher altitudes. So what happens is when they go dig holes and they look at the stratus and they know about where they are in time, they see how many of these plants there were, and they can figure out what the temperature was. So again, this is not disputed. We know that at this exact same time that Göbekli Tepe was buried, although they say now it wasn't buried, but it's confusing, and Atlantis was destroyed. Something happened that caused the temperature of the planet to go up within a year of about 40 degrees. Now, some people will tell me, well, yeah, but if that's rising seawater, then it's not going to bury Atlantis in a day and a night. But this is where you get into the earth crust displacement and you get into the Atlantic ridge, which is very thin. And if the ice is melting, then the weight is shifting. And
Hmm.
anytime the weight shifts and if it shifts quickly, then you get tsunamis,
Hmm.
which fit perfectly. And we have visual evidence from the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory satellites, whatever, of the Western Sahara starting at the Richat structure to the Atlantic Ocean, which is 345 miles, which is important. And we can see the water runoff from some tsunami that had come all the way into the center of Africa. And we also can corroborate that because we have whale bones in the middle of the Sahara Desert that date to 9600 BCE. They're not fossilized. They don't fossilize that quickly. But there's no way a whale gets 345 miles inland and then dies without some help, and that help would be the tsunami. So that's all the stuff that's going on. And then I mentioned we're in the middle of the pre-pottery Neolithic, and then we're 400 years after the start of agriculture, and we're hip deep in the middle of what they call the Neolithic Renaissance or the Neolithic Revolution, which is where all of a sudden we see all this activity and people doing interesting things. So sorry, but now that's everything that was going on to the planet.
No, no. Let me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna put a pin in my other question for a second, because when you were on Coast to Coast the other day, and I was listening to the show, it got brought up about the idea of the Great Flood, deluge, that kind of thing. And I wrote a paper a long time ago. Believe it or not, presented it at a conference. But
Okay,
it
good
was
for you.
about, yeah, it was about the flood myths, and it was about how each culture has their own flood myth, and is this telling of some great thing, not necessarily a biblical thing. I'm myself, I stay away from the religious aspect of it. I try to be more agnostic on that. But do you believe, is there a tie-in with that? Is there a tie-in with this concept that there may have been some sort of worldwide water raise? Does that match with the dates, or is it just completely
Well,
not connected?
yeah, and George asked me that same question. I think he was looking for a connection.
He
The
likes that, though. He likes that.
I
He
know.
likes to tweak that a little bit.
Yeah. Um, so the Bible, there's a great criticism of the Bible if taken as history, because they can only, if you add up all the dates and you move them backwards, you only get about 6,000 years ago.
Hmm.
So then, and then people will use that to criticize religious people. I'm actually not very religious, but
Hmm.
they'll say things like, well, Christians think the earth is only 6,000 years old, those silly people. And there's a lot of other anecdotal evidence that I'm not familiar with that ties to that 6,000 date, which is halfway between us and Atlantis. So when I look at it logically, I always go back to Troy and Henrik Schliemann. And you get people and they'll say, well, Troy, well, I think Troy was Troy 8. Well, I think it was Troy 7. And the problem there is, we have civilizations building on top and building on top and building on top and building on top. And the nature of the geography, these places are picked for a reason. So let's say that there was a huge flood in 12,000 or 11,600 BC. Let's say there was another one in 600. I don't know if there was or not, but they're going to start to layer on top of each other. So for us, it's going to be hard to separate which was which. And we see this everywhere. You look at the Inca, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Olmecs. You have layer upon layer upon layer of civilization built on each one.
Hmm.
The challenge is, and people dismiss it, but I think there's like 212 flood myths or something.
Yeah.
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 So I don't know that they're all talking about the same exact one. They might be, but I think there's been so many over the thousands of years that there is something to it. When you look at the evidence we have with the Richat structure in Atlantis, you can absolutely see that a massive wave of water came over the west coast of Africa and went hundreds of miles inland. Now they think the Richat structure was a volcanic dome. So here we're dumping thousands of gallons, millions of gallons of seawater into a volcano. So you're going to get some kooky things happening. So I do think that if Charles Hapgood and the Earth crust displacement theories and all of that, I think there's a common thread there. My work on Atlantis doesn't take me to the end of that road, though. All
Hmm.
I can tell you is there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that would suggest something goes on every 6 to 12,000 years, and then maybe there's another cycle outside of that that's a lot worse.
Yeah.
That seems to involve the stability we think we have on land changing and water moving around and, and being involved.
Yeah, I want to. Part of the reason I want to bring that up is there's a human nature to be able to connect the unknown with something that either is known or believed in. So for somebody who believes in the flood myth, it's a lot easier for them to go, well, wait, that ties in with that's where Atlantis went, or that's where this happened. We want that um that ability to make sense out of the unknown. So I
Yeah,
think
and
people go to
I
that.
I have a rule. I have a rule that I made with this. I guess this would be another one of my foundational assumptions. I said we can't assume that just because they lived before us, they were idiots,
We
right?
do though. We that is so, isn't it? Like
Oh
we
man,
have.
let me tell you, everything we don't know was a religious ceremony. It's like, oh, they built stone, what religious ceremony, and they would walk up the processional with torches, and it's like, maybe, I mean, maybe, but that can't be the answer to everything. And they're not all stupid. I mean, if you got to spend your time either hunting a goat because you want to eat, or digging a hole because you're going to hope corn comes out of it in 6 months,
Mhm.
you're busy, right? And people do start to specialize. Agriculture allowed us to start to specialize, so we could start to do things like look at the sky and ponder, and not always just be chasing the next rabbit we got to eat.
Mhm.
But it doesn't mean we were stupid. Matter of fact, in Plato, in what's it called, it's like the politician, what's it called, the statesman, he
Mhm.
talks about time travel. He has a whole, and this is written 2,500 years ago, and he has a whole section he goes into where he says, well, these cataclysms that happen, some of them are really bad. In fact, one happened and the entire universe spun backwards, and when it spun backwards, people became unborn, they de-aged and became unborn. People that had died in battle came up out of the grave. People's hair, people with beards, the beards grew in, they got shorter, and people de-aged, they look younger. This is Plato. No one talks about this. But and then in the laws, which is a very boring, incredibly boring work to read. Part of the setup is, he says, okay, look, everyone, we know that these civilizations get wiped out all the time, right? Does anyone disagree with that? And basically, was like, no, we just accept it. We don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about what you want to talk
Yeah.
about. He's like, okay, well, next time they get wiped out, if we're starting with a clean slate, what might be the laws we could put in place to make it better? Because that was always what he was trying to do. But
Mm.
he tells us that it's common knowledge that these cataclysms happen. And then he talks about what we would consider science fiction. Now, for the science fiction, he's not saying it's real. He's not saying it's real. He's saying, this is one of his allegories. Imagine if this is fantasy. But that mindset, the ability to think like that, we don't attribute that back to someone writing in 400 BCE. We think he's an idiot. We think he doesn't know what he's talking about. But no, they were just as smart as us, maybe more so, because we think we're smart because we're busy all the time. But they
Mm.
had lots of time to think.
Yeah, if they had iPhones, then they'd be distracted as well.
Well,
It
but then
would.
then we'd be arguing that Apple is a mythical creature that invented communication mechanisms in megalith or something, but it's all fake. It's all bullshit. There's no way they were holding something to their head and talking across the planet. That's just ridiculous. We can't do that today. So
Yeah,
whatever.
don't get them started on Android. That'd be a whole other.
Whole other thing. Hey, with either one of those, at least we'd have good records of what everyone did.
Oh, it would be. We wouldn't be having this discussion then.
No, that
So
was a
let- so-
sarcastic political
So
joke.
let me
Yeah,
come
sorry.
back to the. I'm going to come back to the question then. So
Yeah.
let's go back to the structure. So what do we have there now? What are we looking at?
Well, we've got a lot. And there's another line I read. Let me find it here real quick, because there's so much that Plato tells us that we've ignored. So here's what he tells us about what the Earth looks like after one of these cataclysms. And this also describes exactly what we see at the Rishat structure. So just
Okay.
to set it up, at the Rishat structure, we have bedrock, and the bedrock is in a formation of Atlantis. It has a center island, and then it has two concentric rings of land, and then surrounded by very low-lying areas that would have been underwater, that would have been water. So it has that. But here's what Plato says the Earth looks like after one of these things. He says, the Earth has fallen away all around and sunk out of sight. The consequence is that in comparison of what was then, there are remaining only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called. As in the case of small islands, all the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the land being left. And that's what we see. We see the bones and the skeleton of this thing that he's described. Now, because it's in bedrock, and because it was covered in silt, basically topsoil, because of all the rain, his measurements have been preserved. Now, if he had given us elevation measurements, they'd be off some, right? Because he tells us like they had to dig through 100 feet of topsoil to make a canal. Well, okay, so now we know there's 100 foot of soil between where people were living and the bedrock that we can see today.
Hmm.
Now, the other thing physically that we found, and don't let this in without me rattling off all the ways that the Rishat structure meets what he says,
Okay.
but I'm actually working on. I've got a documentary pitch into Discovery, although I haven't heard from them for a while, so I might have to put it on Goya. They've agreed to distribute it. We have found massive canals and land. A friend of mine calls it terraforming. That word is technically correct, but it brings too much with it. But basically, Plato tells us there was this huge plain. There were 60,000 farms on it, each 10 stadia by 10 stadia, which is about a mile by a mile, and that they had done massive earthworks to be able to grow things. And we found all that. I've had a geologist look at it. She's also a geochemist. And we found it in two different places that one is 10 miles to the north, one is about 20 miles to the south, which would have been down the river that flowed to the sea. That we can talk about. But we have that, and we're going to get lucky. This guy who's my friend, David Hansen. He's actually going back next month. I'm helping fund another expedition there, and all of these canals have so salt water comes in, the ocean comes in, some of it drains off, some of it evaporates. That leaves lots of salt. One of Mauritania still exports hundreds of thousands of dollars of salt a year. They still have a lot of salt mines. But when it sits there on the ground and then the temperature changes, right, from kind of climate 80s, you can grow stuff to what the Sahara is 135 degrees, it forms what they call evaporites. So we have salt evaporites. And what's going to be good is they're very hard. They're hard as rocks, and they've formed over all of these canals so that, I mean, 11,000 years is an incredibly long time, but a lot of this is now covered by sand. So we have the base canals and work they did. Then we have a foot or so of evaporites, which is just basically baked salt over thousands of years. And then we have a lot of sand on top of it. But the evaporites is going to have preserved some of this work from erosion. So we can still see it today. If we hadn't had the evaporites, if it hadn't been salt water, probably most of it would have been gone through wind erosion and other things.
Hmm.
So we have that there. We have the structure there, which fits his description. And then we've also found, as I mentioned already, all of the tools and signs of habitation that you find from a Neolithic society.
So I want to hit what you just said again. There are artifacts, there are tools. You
Yeah,
are
oh yeah,
finding these things, or
yeah,
they are being found.
yeah,
Is
being
it
found.
under?
Yeah.
It's underwater at this point, or is it
No,
exposed?
it's somewhere between, it's about 1,500 feet or so above sea level, uh,
Okay,
which some people view as a problem because they want Atlantis to have seawater all around it.
they have a
Um,
mental block. Yeah.
they have a mental block because when you actually look at, and this is one of the criticisms of the site, is it's too high. But if you actually look how weather works, and we learned this in second grade, no one read the Republic in 10th grade, but much before that, when we were still paying attention in second grade, they taught us about weather. And they said, well, you have water, and then the sun shines on it, and it gets hot and evaporates, and it goes up and it forms clouds. And those clouds move over, they might just stay over the ocean and rain on the ocean, but sometimes they move over land, sometimes they move over mountains.
Hmm.
They rain, the water comes down, flows down through the mountains, through the land, and then makes its way in a river back to the sea. And that's the cycle.
Right.
And we have that exact setup for the Rishat structure in this time period. And I mentioned there's nothing that we have to change about our current view of history. It's well documented that a river ran right through this thing. So it would have been in a river, would have been in a lake about 10 miles on either side with a runoff river flowing down this gentle slope. And I measured the slope. It's like 0.007%, which is perfect. It's a perfect slope. It'd be very navigable up and down. The water's lazy, so it would still flow to the ocean, but it's exactly, what we thought we had. And there's another line that always gets ignored. Let me find it, because people don't like it. It's very inconvenient. So here's what Plato tells us about where the city was. He says, the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains, which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even and of an oblong shape, extending in the one direction 3,000 stadia. Okay, well, that means it's 3,000 stadia from the sea.
Hmm.
So I mentioned the stadia is 607 feet. You multiply 607 times 3,000 divided by 5,820, you get 345 miles. So how far do you think the Rishat structure is from the sea?
Oh, I have a guess.
345 miles.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, exactly. Exactly. And in the satellite images, you can see where the waterway would have been. It makes
Mhm.
sense. Now you would ask me where to look. I'm bouncing around a little bit because there's other stuff to go over, but I read the line about all the topsoil getting sucked off. One of the things Plato says is that after this cataclysm, there was a shawl of mud that blocked the waterway. Well, this is another thing. If you think about it, if it were the Azore Islands or Antarctica or wherever, you're not gonna have a shawl of mud in the ocean that blocks anything. You know what I mean? But here we have a river and we have the water coming in and then being pulled back, and it pulls all that topsoil down. It blocks the river. And
Mhm.
sure enough, you can see it on the Piri Reis map, which we can talk about. You can see it on satellite images. About halfway between the Rishat structure and the current Atlantic Ocean are mounds and mounds, huge piles of dirt, mud they've all dried now, but they're sitting there. So, and now this is 150 miles between the Rishat structure and the ocean. So it's not where you're looking; it's in between. But that's where I would look.
Yeah.
Honestly, I want to look at this agriculture stuff, which we are going to look at. In fact, we're going to sample it too to make sure that we're right about the evaporites. But then, if we were going to excavate, it should be where these big mounds of dirt are that would have been mud at the time,
Yeah.
because that's where any of these artifacts, and that has not been excavated. Some people say it's been gone over with a fine tooth comb. No one has even looked. There was a group that looked um, in 2019 or so. But here's the other problem we have. I mentioned civilizations build on top of each other.
Mhm.
The French Foreign Legion was all over Mauritania, and so were the Romans. But the Romans stayed a little bit west and a little bit east of the Rishat structure. The French Foreign Legion built forts all over this thing. So when you look at the satellite images, sitting on the top of the ground, because this was only 150 years ago, you can see these forts. And some people got really excited. They go, "Oh, we found Atlantis." And you go look, it's like, well, that's not Atlantis. This is a bunch of rocks. It's a very temporary type structure, and you can kind of see where they had holes for the rifles to stick out and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So people found that and they just said, "Nah," and then they walked away from it because, but this is the problem of layering that we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you, in your research or even your opinion, what about survivors of the
Yeah.
initial of the original of Atlantis? Like,
Yeah.
there had to be some guy who was visiting relatives in another country when everything went down, and he went, "Whoa, my country, my city's gone. I
Yep.
don't have a home now."
Yep.
Like, are there stories of people who survived?
There are. In fact, it's a brilliant question because I have a good answer for
Oh,
it. So I mentioned that Plato was the primary source, and I mentioned that we wanted to find something to corroborate the primary source. I found two other primary sources that corroborate Plato's story. The first is this guy named Herodotus. Now, we've all heard of Herodotus. He wrote something called the Histories.
mhm.
He was writing in the like 450, 430, 440 BCE. So he was about not quite 80 years ahead of Plato. He was the first one to try and write like a real history. And so the way he structured the histories is that about the first 20, 25%, maybe third, is he kind of wrote down a travel log of everything the Greeks knew about the world. So, be like, okay, you go to Egypt, now turn right, which is west, and go 10 days, and you see this, go 10 days, you see this. And he did that for everything they knew. When he gets to Libya, which is mentioned in Plato and geographically is related to where the Rishat structure is. He says, so you basically go to Egypt, then you head into Libya and you go 10 days, nothing happens. You go 10 more days and you run into these people who call themselves the Atlanteans. Then you go 10 more days and you run into more people that call themselves the Atlanteans, and they live all the way from Libya to the Atlas Mountains, which is kind of along that coast of the Mediterranean. And he says, these people are really weird. He says they don't dream. They have names, but they refuse to let them be written down. They refuse to keep a history of themselves. They're vegetarians, which at this point in time was crazy weird. They live in houses on top of salt, and they spend their days cursing the sun. Well, if you look at the geography, if the Rishat structure was Atlantis, and a big wave came in and wiped everyone out, this is where they would go. This is where the survivors would go. So we have the cultural memory of people called Atlanteans, and it's in a completely separate book. Completely corroborates Plato. Now, by itself, it's not overly interesting because that's got all the information we have. But when you add it to Plato, and you look at the geography, it's a corroboration. We also know the story made it to Egypt, right? So and things like Göbekli Tepe, things like the Sumerians, we start to see, and this is even, some people would argue, a lot of the buildings we start to see in Egypt kind of come out of nowhere. We don't see the build up to it. We don't see the proto hieroglyphical writings over hundreds of years. It just all materializes.
Hmm.
So there's an argument that that could be Atlantean knowledge. I have no evidence that it is, but it is there, and we do have the story, and we have two people. We have Plato through Critias, and we have Crantor, who went and said they saw it in the hieroglyphs. So we have that kind of proof.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's the things like that, because we don't ask about that. Because people say, oh well, the survivors went in their airships and they flew away and with the death ray, and they, that's
Yeah.
the mentality that.
Oh, and even the people that are trying to do it kind of for real-ish, when they find Santorini or they find Minoa, Minoans, these are inconvenient facts, to use a bad term. They've ignored all this. Now here's the last piece. Here's the last corroborating piece I found,
Mhm.
which blew me away. There's a map called the Piri Reis map. Have you heard of that?
I believe I have, actually. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
famous. If you delve into any of this stuff, any of the kooky shows I watch or any of the books I read, in fact, the map has been known for a very long time, and it has its own history, but it kind of became a pop culture reference when Graham Hancock's 1995 book Fingerprints of the Gods came out. He opens with the Piri Reis map. What the Piri Reis map is it was made in 1514. I might get that. I might be off by a year or two. And remember, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So we're 21 years, I think, after he did that. And
Mhm.
we didn't have Google and Google Earth and cell phones. So, if 21 years then wasn't quite as long as 21 years is now. But anyway, the map seems to show more on the left-hand side, more about the North American and South American continent that could have possibly been known, because it wasn't all navigated, at this time period. It seems to show Antarctica without ice. It seems to show between South America and Antarctica a correct representation of the continental shelf, which would have been above water if we were in the last ice age. And it is the person, Piri Reis, who had the map commissioned. He was a navigator, and he had this map commissioned off of all the old maps they had access to, ancient maps they had access to. And the idea was, he wanted, if he's going to go out there, if he's going to be the guy navigating the boat and sailing around, he wanted to know as much as he could and have it in one place. He didn't want to have to carry 50 different maps. What's really interesting, though, and that is what I just said is arguable, or it's debatable, but there's no, people, better arguers can win the debate, but there's no way to know. It's like, does it show the continental shelf below the waterline, or is it just the bottom of South America that's really warped? Now, and my rules are, well, that would mean that the navigators were idiots, and we're not going to assume they're idiots because they're actually doing this stuff. But anyway, long way around the little pond here. On the right hand side is Africa, and no one has ever given two shakes about the right hand side of this. But I'm like, I bought a copy of this thing in 1995 after I read Hancock's book. I've been staring at it for 25 years, and I looked where the Richat structure is, the Eye of the Sahara. And I looked at the Piri Reis map, and in Africa, there is this kooky little city surrounded by a ring of water, up a river that's blocked by a shawl of mud, which he draws. To the north are green mountains, which Plato mentions. Right on the map, an inordinate amount of space is an elephant. Well, Plato tells us that there are a lot of elephants around Atlantis. And it shows the city, and this is where, at the time it was being drawn, it was just a Sahara Desert, just like it is today. And people say, well, they could have drawn anything they wanted. It's like, no, this dude, Perry's, he's gonna get in a boat. His life depends on this. He's not going to accept a river leading up into the middle of the Sahara Desert with green mountains, where today there's nothing but sand and 135 degree temperatures. Now, he's just not going to accept that, right? That wasn't the point of it. So I think, and it's not disputed, this map was put together from older maps, and there is no way to explain a city in the middle of a ring of water in the Western Sahara Desert where the Richat structure is, other than Atlantis. There's no other myth. There's no other history that could even imagine that.
Well, I mean, it sounds like on one end of the spectrum, you have, okay, there is this city that is Atlantis. It is this, you have it.
Yeah,
And at the other end of the spectrum, it's not a worst case scenario, but for lack of a better word, worst case scenario is there is an advanced civilization that was at this point. If you want to argue about whether or not it was Atlantis or it was the basis for this myths, that's a different discussion. But there is an advanced civilization that was in this spot.
yeah.
That sounds undeniable.
I think it is. I think, especially when you look at the agriculture, but let's look at what Plato calls Atlantis. So here is every measurement that can be derived from the work, and here is how it meets with the Risha. I just want to rattle these off real quick. I mentioned the Green Sahara. He mentioned that the climate and soil supported agriculture, and he mentions 9600 BC. There's no way he would magically get that date, any other way. But so it matches that. The salt from the water coming in. He tells us that there were lots of precious metals and that they mined a lot. Mauritania's biggest export is gold and iron, so it fits that way. He tells us that the capital had geographic proximity to Libya, Egypt, Greece, and Europe, because he says the Atlanteans had conquered Libya as far as Egypt, and parts of Europe all the way to Greece. So you got to be close, so it can't be Antarctica. Antarctica could be a province or whatever, but this thing called Atlantis has to be close enough for it to make sense to conquer those areas. Well, the Western Sahara has to have the sufficient landmass, which we already talked about. We talked about the lake structure and the two concentric circles. This is the only place on the planet that actually looks like Atlantis.
Yeah.
Plato tells us that everything was made with white, black, and red stone. Well, the rocks of Mauritania and all the rocks around the Richat structure, they are all white, black, and red stones. I mentioned, he says it was gently sloping to the sea, 300 stadia, which everyone ignores, but we can all go read it. This is, which is 345 miles, is exactly 345 miles. He tells us they dug a 50 stadia canal from the outer ring to an inner harbor. Well, 50 stadia, when you multiply all those numbers, it comes up to 5.8 miles. That basically gives us the radius of the circle. So when we look at the radius of the Richat structure, you want to guess what the radius is? 5.8 miles. 5.8 miles. And it ends in a big circle on the inside that has been dug out, like an inner harbor. Plato also tells us they mined rocks and stuff from underneath the center island. Well, we can see it. We can see it right there. He says on this canal, they dug it 100 feet deep and 100 feet wide. And on the outer ring, they had to cut into the ring an opening of 3 stadia so that the boats could get through, and they built a bridge over it. Well, on the outer ring of the Richat structure, on the southern end, which is where the river would have been, where it would have flowed, down that slope, there's a cutout, and guess how big it is? Guess how wide it is? Yeah, it's 1,800 feet, which is 3 stadia. He tells us that it was open to the south and had mountains to the north. Richat structure has mountains to the north and is open to the south. He tells us it had hot and cold running water. Well, if this is a volcanic dome, then volcanoes produce hot and cold running water. Tells us there are lots of elephants. This part of Africa is still highly populated with elephants. And I mentioned the Piri Reis map has an elephant drawn on it. Yeah. He says that there were green mountains. Well, these mountains would have been green in the Green Sahara and all of that. We have the term Atlas and the Atlas Mountains, which is the name of the king of Atlantis. He tells us it was bordered by less impressive mountains significantly inland. Well, when you look at, as I mentioned, Mali, and you look at the inland ring around Central Africa off of the western piece, you have low, not that impressive mountains that border it, which is also why he would have considered it a continent. Because just like Egypt, just like Europe and Asia are 2 continents, well, why are they 2 continents? Well, because they're separated by distance and mountains, right? Now, we can argue tectonic plates, but Plato doesn't know anything about tectonic plates. So
it just checks all the boxes. It checks all the boxes.
Yeah.
Is there a tipping point? So like the next step is you're going in and you're doing investigation archaeology. You're going in and you talked about going in there to check stuff out. Right.
I got one more.
I'm so sorry.
I got the big one. I saved the big one for last.
Oh, bring it on.
Okay. So the last thing he tells us is that the way to Atlantis was outside the Strait of Gibraltar, directly outside the Strait of Gibraltar, which Western Africa is. Right. And it was on the way to the opposite continent. Now, that's kind of important. That means that the Egyptian priests of 600 BCE knew about an opposite continent. That's interesting. But so I was like, how can I test that? Because some people like the Azores, which are kind of north, and it doesn't really make sense. So I'm like, how can we test if people would at that time have taken this way to the opposite continent. So I'm like, you know what? Only test I have is Columbus, because he's the first one we know of that we have records of that tried to do this journey. So I'm like, well, how did Columbus, when he didn't know where the New World was, and then when he knew where it was, what route did he take? So I looked, and sure enough, he leaves Spain. He goes down by the Canary Islands. He goes past where the river entrance would have been to the Strait of Gibraltar, and then he goes across to South America and to the Bahamas, exactly as Plato says you would to go to the opposite continent. So it's indisputable. This is and the ocean currents take you by this too. So
Mm,
the geography matches perfectly outside what they call the Pillar of Hercules, which we call the Strait of Gibraltar.
right.
It all lines up. In fact, when you do all the measurements, it comes out to 99.32%. Yeah,
You might be onto something with this.
close.
Just maybe.
Yeah.
Just, but so when you go out, is there a, I mean, obviously there's doubters. Obviously there's people who don't agree. There's laymen as well as scientists and always, because you have to prove it.
Yeah, got
Is
over.
there a tipping point, or is there a holy grail when you go out there, short of walking out there and there's etched in the stone, welcome to Atlantis?
Yeah.
Is there something that you can find or that you're looking for that says, look, here is definitive proof. Here is something that can't be denied. This is a huge step toward proving this theory.
Well, so we're dealing with what they call a circumstantial case. There's nothing wrong with a circumstantial case,
Mhm.
but we're 11,000 years on. So what we need to find is an overwhelming circumstantial case, which is what I believe I've built. Are we going to find the blinking road sign that says Atlantis? I don't think so. I think it's too long, and this area has just been blasted to death. I
Yeah.
do think, because when I had the geologists look at geologists, these professionals are funny. I had this person look at, and I just took pictures from Google Maps of these different areas where we have the canals I mentioned in the agriculture, and I had them look at it, and they gave me a very honest answer. They said, "Yeah, we think it's evaporites, but the grid pattern, the stuff we're seeing, is very odd. They didn't know how that would occur naturally." I said, "Well, do you think it could be ancient agriculture?" And then they back off a little bit, and they're like, "Nah, if it was, someone would have already studied it. We would have already found it." And I said, "Well, what do you think, could be Atlantis?" And like, "Whoa, no, we're out."
Yeah.
So the problem is, to get anyone to accept it that is mainstream, it'll ruin their career. They can't be the first, and since no one's going to be the first, you're not going to get there. So I think we just need to build the overwhelming case, and then kind of do what they did with Troy, which is just make it so that it's harder to explain why not than it is why. And I think if you apply logic, which we know there are people there, and you have this fantastic place to live, why wouldn't they have lived there? DNA says that civilization came out of Africa, that they weren't idiots. So if all of a sudden they can now live in this place, they've started agriculture, so they don't have to hunt and gather all the time. Why wouldn't that be one of the first civilizations we start to see to start to do things that we understand, like what eventually the Greeks will do and the Egyptians will do and everyone else will do? Why
Yeah.
wouldn't that be the case? And there's no answer. It's indefensible. It has to be the case,
Yeah.
because all this other evidence aligns up to it.
There's this hubris that like we're the best. No, but like you said, like they were idiots. They couldn't have done
Yeah,
anything.
yeah, yeah. I
They
mean,
didn't.
yeah. Our own arrogance. So what I always say, I have this when I'm doing my corporate stuff. I say, bright, well-intending people with the same information and the same goals will generally reach the same conclusion.
Right.
So, are we dealing with bright, well-intending people? I don't know. That's not answerable, right? But do we have the same information? No, because they won't listen to any of this. And do we have the same goals? No.
Yeah.
Their goals are to further their career by staying inside the lines and teaching what they're supposed to teach. Because if you step outside of the lines today, you're doomed, and it's hard. It's next to impossible to get back in.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
just where we are.
So you're heading out there personally? Are you going out
No,
to do?
David Hanson's going out.
Okay.
My worldwide adventures are over.
Oh,
I know, but he's been there once. He was there about a year and a half ago or so, maybe 2 years ago. I've lost track. And he's going
okay.
back next month in October.
Next month. Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Oh yeah. And
Okay.
I'm helping him fund it out of my own pocket. Not a tremendous amount of money, but he's fitting the bill for most of it. But
Yeah.
we've agreed that he's going to get samples and a lot of photos of these agriculture places with these evaporates, because that's the next step, is to try and find someone who can look at it objectively and comment on it. Because I think it's
Yeah.
a smoking gun. And I don't have I'm working on a second book where I'll include a lot more of this stuff and a lot more of those images. Because when you see them again, there's nothing natural that's going to make 50 canals in a line loop around like S's and do the kind of stuff. It looks like it's proto terrace farming, which would exactly be what we should find in 9600 BC. And the Atlas Mountains I mentioned have ancient, unknown, very advanced terrace farms, which of course would be logical if that's where the Atlanteans went. And you can still go see them today. They're famous. They're world famous.
Wow, I can't wait to see the results in October. Then, do you? We'll take a second. Let's talk about the book real quick. Where can people get it? What should they look for?
Yeah, it's Atlantis Solved, the final definitive proof. It's not available on Amazon, or you can go to the publisher website, frequency99.com, and that'll guide you to being able to purchase it.
And all the links are in the show notes. So everyone go check it out. This has been cool. Like I interview a lot of fun people, but this has been fun. Like this has actually been, I like being able to, ponder a little bit. Like I want to see the photos. I need to do my own deep dive, but it's definitely been great. So thank you so much for spending the time with me and talking about this. So you got me even more curious now.
Good.
So that's a good thing.
And just to close, in the book, I did take a scientific approach, which means it's repeatable and other people can look at everything I found, independently verify it, and reach their own conclusion. And we don't normally get that with Atlantis. So absolutely, please do. And if you reach a different conclusion than I do, please let me know.
Yeah. And you don't have crazy hair going, it was aliens. It was.
It's pretty crazy under that hat. I got to be honest with you. But the hat masks a lot of that.
If you are a coffee drinker like me, you know there's good coffee and great coffee. And then there's amazing coffee. And at the top is Kona coffee. But did you know the Kona blends you see in stores can actually contain as little as 10% Kona coffee? So go right to the source. Koa Plantation coffee has been named the best coffee in the world by Forbes magazine. And you can get it now by visiting koacoffee.com. Don't stand for anything other than the best. Koa Plantation Coffee. Save more when you get their triple pack. koacoffee.com. The link is in the show notes. Hey everybody, hope you enjoyed the show. Help us spread the word by subscribing and leaving a review. If you want to support us even more, you can find a link to our Patreon account in the show notes. And if you're one of our diehard fans, head on over to thevikingdogstore.com where you can find official Open Highway merchandise to show your support to the entire world. But most of all, thanks for listening.
For the highways of America, which for so many years were an assortment of as many designs and pavements as there were states, are now becoming one big road that can take you anywhere faster, safer, and more directly than ever before. What is this big road? Where is it going? How much has been built? How much is yet to come? These are questions we ask. Certainly traveling the entire system would be a memorable experience, but few of us have the time for such a trip.
The Open Highway is a production of Viking Dog LLC, all rights reserved, 2022. The Open Highway and Viking Dog may receive compensation from promoted products and affiliate links or promo codes featured on the show, in the show notes, or related platform materials. Neither guests or Viking Dog are ever compensated for any appearance on the program.